Hi, Chris.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, and it's my pleasure to interview you. And my first question is, what is good musical composition for you?
Oh, that's a great question. To start things up. A good musical composition. I think, obviously, it's down to whoever's listening to composition in the first place. But for me personally, I think it's something that shows innovation in technology. So, obviously, since the dawn of time, where music appreciation is concerned, people are always looking for the novel and the new. But I think today, what's more interesting in that respect, we're still chasing the novel and the new, but we're looking at how new technologies such as, the Internet of Things or machine learning could enable us to find that novelty. So for me, it's personally, it's for new technologies that show new ways of musical expression.
Yes, and do you um can you remember the last piece, which was who has these qualities which you mentioned before, which you listened, right?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of one of my colleagues' works, and he still, astounds me the kind of creativity he comes up with, but also this solid knowledge of technology. And his name's Hong Shou Fan, and one of his piece Metamorphoses is incredible. So I think, yeah, probably that one.
And how would you describe your own music? Well,
My own musical approach.
yes.
Um, well, So I came from more of an acousmatic tradition a few years ago, but then I saw the benefit of using interactive technology. So nowadays, I actually compose the music acousmatically, but I use the interactive technologies to deconstruct the music, if you put into little chunks and fragments, if you will, and then place it around the scene, such as a video game, for example. So I think, just to summarize, I think it's in two parts. It's the composed music is one part of the process, and the second part of the process is taking that composed music and putting it into tiny little sections, and then seeing how interactivity can actually give it some sense of cohesion and some sense of structure. Because I think the interactivity part is important because it gives it a sense of, not just novelty, but it gives it a sense of being able to change some of the music in real time, and that ties in with different themes, such as one of the themes I'm interested in is the human part of music in terms of being able to make music from the body, from biometrics. So I think, yeah, that addresses that point as well.
And what triggers you, right? This Your interest to this biometric sensors and gesture controls.
Um, so I think my inspiration is mainly, I think it comes from two things again. It comes from my past experience of obviously loving fixed form music, and secondly, my love of interactive technologies in games, for example. So I think on a low level, those would be my influences. But higher level, I think it's much more open actually. It's much more open form because I came from uh, a love of kind of ambient sort of post rock music, which is quite different, but it has some similarities in a way, in the sense that both kind of genres of music look for the sublime in a way. I think. So personally, I'm interested in combining the sublime, as it were, and open form music with new technologies and the sense of what it is to be human, I guess.
Mhm. And if you would, if you would live in Berlin, would your music would be different?
Berlin. Do you know what? I've never actually been to Berlin. I've always wanted to, but I've heard a lot about it. If I lived in Berlin, would it be different? Maybe. I assume so because it's such a creative place, I'm told, and especially electroacoustic music scene is quite vibrant there. Um, so I would assume so. I don't know if it would be much different in terms of the interactivity approach and the tech, because I think your hands are kind of tied in that respect, in terms of which technologies you can use to achieve certain musical outcomes, because that's kind of like universal, right, in a way. But I guess the little networks you create could inspire you to create different approaches. So yeah, it
Yes,
might be
yes, yes. And if you have different gender, would your music could be different?
a different gender. That's a really difficult question. um, I I assume so because just from the simple philosophical fact that I don't know what anyone else's kind of brain is like other than my
Yes,
own.
yes, yes. Get it, get it. Uh, and how your music changed in the last 10 years?
Last 10 years. So I went from being an instrumental composer, actually playing in bands around Birmingham in the UK, and creating songs as part of a rock band, but also a metal band as well. I really loved metal at the time. And then so I went from that tradition, which I was really used to. So growing up in the around Birmingham in the Black Country in England, there was a real appreciation of heavy metal music, stuff like this. So I went from that tradition to composing acousmatically. So when I met Ricardo Clement at Manchester University in 2015, it sort of opened my eyes up to using sounds just to create music and this acousmatic tradition. So I got really obsessed with acousmatic music and composing a fixed media acousmatic music. And then following that, I thought, this is really interesting because I can compose fixed media acousmatic music, but I can add interactive events to that music if I use a video game to disseminate the music, for example, which people don't expect, and there's a live element to it. So that's where I find myself nowadays, in 2022, is still appreciating the acousmatic tradition and fixed form music, but finding new technologies which allow me to interact with it and shape it in real time. So that's my kind of trajectory, I think, over the last 10 years.
Yes, yes. And which is the most important technologies or technological artifacts it could be, which you use the most in your pieces? It could be both softwares or hardwares. Which you use the most? You looking back, right?
Softwares, I think overall softwares.
Yes. And what kind of software you use the most?
It ranges from quite specific musical software, such as Logic Pro and Sibelius and stuff like this. But in the last 6 years, or maybe a little bit longer, I got into using Max and Pure Data. And then from in the last 3 or 4 years, I've started to use hardware interfaces such as Myo armbands, which I'm using quite a lot at the moment. So yeah, in the last few years, I've used hardware interfaces because when you pair those with the software I was using before, you can create ways of actually shaping sounds through gesture, through human gesture. So I think it's not so much a fact of using one or the other. It's actually using them together to form something unique.
Yes, yes, got it. And what is your way of composing, right? How you start and what stages you go through?
Okay, the process. So I usually come up with sort of ideas in my head about how something could sound or how it could be, but the structure for me is always quite loose, so it's less important for me. I just find ways to bridge ideas together. That's not a problem, but the main problem is actually getting this vision from my head into the actual real space and actually communicating that effectively and seeing if it translates well or not. So more practically and less high level, what I do is I start recording sounds just on the guitar, for example.
Yes.
And then when I find interesting sounds on the guitar, for example, I start to extract some of the more interesting sounds from that larger sound for using some sort of software tools such as Cecilia, for
Yes.
example. And then when I've got those sounds together, I just get them in the door and I see how well they can fit together once they're actually on in the software, the music software. And then the end process of that, once I'm happy with the results, is to think about how can that then become part of an interactive composition. So if I were to um, play this piece within a video game, how can it fit together and how can it actually bridge together whilst it's in the video game engine? Because I use video game engines quite a lot to make the piece interactive, even though I'm performing it in a musical way.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. And then how it ends, and when do you make scores or
This is something which is I've been having a bit of trouble with, both trying to find a rationale for it and also trying to think how it could work, because scores are inherently made for fixed media music, right?
yes,
If you try to use them in an interactive media way, then it sort of changes their use and it changes their relevance. So, for example, can you fully predict what's going to happen when you play an interactive composition? I don't really think you can. So, therefore, how can you translate that into a fixed score that someone can follow?
yes,
So, the last two compositions, I haven't really given them a score. I've given them a program note
yes,
and
yes,
some loose instructions, but apart from that, it's sort of, go ahead and see what happens.
yes. So basically, I understand, right? So okay, there are like composers, right, which ends classically, and they delivery to the musicians are scores and program notes. You have program notes and some software, right?
Yeah, some like instructions, some like just a bit of detail about what
Yes,
you
but
loosely could do.
yes, but you have some software as well, right? Some
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, yeah,
software and some kind of sound files, right?
yeah, yeah. That's right. It's interesting as well because some people describe software nowadays as a score in itself. So I guess that could be a score.
Yes, yes,
That's it.
right. Yes, okay. And oh, um, so do you when you write do you write the software on your own or do you have a are you coder as well or
Yeah, yeah. I'm a coder and programmer. I'm not the strongest programmer in the world, but I kind of I manage to make things happen in terms of what I want to happen musically. That's been a big challenge in my workflow, switching from an acousmatic composer where you don't really have to worry about that too much, to an interactive composer where you do have to worry about that much more. Is
yes,
trying to bridge musical ideas with technical limitations in terms of programming limitations and
yes,
knowledge, because you have to be quite fluent on both musical language and programming language in order to make things happen. In order to make art nowadays. That's one I can see that being quite a limitation challenge nowadays. People wanting to explore new media and interactive media. It's the sense that there's still a knowledge gap in terms of having to know how to use programming languages well to develop an interactive media product, an interactive media piece of art.
hmm
Um, so I'd say in the last 5 years, I've had to learn how to program fairly well in order to make these interactive artistic pieces happen. So using things like starting out with things like Max to using Python eventually, and then to build my own sort of custom software to make these things happen.
yes, yes. And you mentioned Python, so do you use as well as different machine learning or approaches?
Well, in the past few years, I didn't use Python specifically for machine learning. I was actually using Wekinator, which is much more intuitive, and it was an interactive machine learning software by Rebecca Feebrink, and that was incredible because it had everything I needed to in it for me to use. So, for example, I needed it because I was using these wearable sensors as part of my artistic pieces, but the data from these wearable sensors is so complicated. You need those machine learning algorithms to simplify the data and make it usable in a musical way. So Wekinator bridged that gap for me between my artistic ideas and the technical way of delivering those. In the last 6 months, I've started to use Python for machine learning and looking at TensorFlow libraries, um, just to think about how deep learning could be used this time instead of um, the algorithms you find in Wekinator.
Yes, yes. And can we just trivialize, right? Or let's say simplify, but in that way that your trajectory is from from scores towards softwares and from writing scores towards writing code.
Yeah, no, that's a good summary, I would say. Um, yeah, that simplifies it well for me. I don't think I got anything to add to that.
And what do you fear as a most as composer?
What do I fear? Ooh, I think in the interactive music space, you always, especially as a composer and often performer of your same pieces, you always have the fear of performing them because you know things can go wrong in this space. Like for example, your max patch could just stop working, and that stops the whole performance. Or your max patch can't communicate well to another computer which is hosting the visuals, and it's meant to be a real time thing. So there's been a few moments when I perform in one of my own works in a different country, and things have gone wrong.
Got it.
But yeah, that's my worst fear.
Got it. Right. It's a fragile nature of technology, right?
Yeah.
And you said write videos. So do you consider yourself as multimedia or multi-sensory composer as well?
I do. On in the past few years, I do. Before that, I wouldn't consider myself multimedia or even audio visual. But in the past few years, I've made game engine sort of works. So yeah, I would definitely consider myself multimedia composer nowadays.
Yes. And what was trigger why you switched?
Because I saw the benefit of, if you just placed a composition, even if it was interactive within the game engine, you only get so much degree of interest and degree of curiosity about what's going on. I realise that you can't really get the audience's attention for too long if you don't include visuals. But then again, visuals are a really interesting way of representing musical ideas. So I saw the benefit in that, and I sort of tried to put two and two together and thought, actually, this is really interesting to try and do. So yeah, that's where it stemmed from, really.
Yes, and how it changed as a process of composing, right? Is it different to
It's
compose?
different. Yeah, it is different because I don't now I don't have to worry so much about just composing the music. I have to worry about the visual representation as well, and that not only just takes more time to think about, or what kind of aesthetic makes sense, what kind of visual aesthetic makes sense with the music. So no, I'm no longer just a composer of music. I'm having to think about the visual side as well, which historically I never thought I would do, but nowadays I thought it's really interesting. So
Yes.
so it's changed my workflow in that sense.
And how it works for you, right? So you create sound and then you add visuals, or you create visuals and you add sound, or you do it in parallel, or you do in some cycles, or how it works, right?
Yeah, I would say I've done both approaches. It's whatever I feel inspired by at the time. So, for example, I can compose I can compose the work like I did in Viano, and then after, I only then start to think about the visuals and how it might be represented. So the main idea for that piece, Viano, is to work with a pianist and see how they can wear wearable tech to augment their instrument and make new sort of ways of expression while they're playing. But if you put that in the virtual space, things change because you have new ways of expression So, for example, if you grab if you make a certain sound on the piano and then that sort of note is displayed to the audience in the game and grows and shatters into thousands of pieces and then hits other objects in the game, then that creates music. So you've got new challenges in that respect. Um, so I would say it started off with the music, and then then it was translating into the visual world. But then afterwards, when I was finalising the piece and the mechanics of the piece, I realised that there are moments where things could be embellished in the work, because if you put these kind of mechanics in, where you explode things and then the fragments affect other objects, then you're adding more music to the piece already. And those mechanics are really interesting, at least for me, because they create different ways, like I said earlier, different ways of expression. So I would say, just to summarize, it was music, visuals, and then both.
Okay.
Was the end.
Good. And why do you still compose?
It sounds really cliche, and it probably is, but just because I love composing music. um, I love the possibility. I think for me, composing music is very cathartic, and it's just a really good outlet. It's sort of like it's a creative itch, right? That people get. I've been playing music since I was about 8 years old, so it's been a long time now. So I guess it's just part of who I am as well.
And during this century, right? How change new music scene in England?
New music.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it was inspired by music concrete. In the '60s and what was going on in Europe. I think there's been quite a few landmark new music composers such as Trevor Wishart, for example, who've really pushed the idea of using the acousmatic medium forward. Um, I think since then there've been a number of composers who are looking at using sort of interactivity in their music. But I don't think there's been as much momentum as there has been, especially like in new music media in England and the UK. I'm still waiting for that to properly kick off, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And how audience change?
Audiences, what
Yes.
for new music?
Yes.
I don't know. In my experience, I think there's been they're much more receptive to and much more open minded nowadays than in the past. There's there's much more of an appetite and an open mindedness for new media and new music, which is great.
Yes.
With people I've spoken to.
And who are they, right? And what is the age group or what?
Usually younger people, admittedly. But I'm hoping that those younger attitudes towards new media and new music will filter into next generations. And I'm sure it will, to be honest. Um, I don't know exactly why people, in my opinion, are more open-minded towards new music, but I'm gladly accepting that.
Yeah. And how you see new music scene, right? In 10 years, right? In England.
In the UK alone, in England, that's a difficult question. There are a few trends happening in the UK at the moment, but I think they ripple much. They ripple because the world's quite globalized
Yes.
nowadays. They take place all over the world. But I think the idea that you can have interactivity in music and you're starting to get interfaces which are much more accessible nowadays, such as mono armbands, for example. I think for me personally, there'll be a trend between using gestural interfaces and being able to make music from just gesture alone. Especially because machine learning is becoming more savvy, libraries are becoming more accessible, but the only limitation is the knowledge gap of being able to apply machine learning algorithms to your musical workflow. So hopefully in the next 10 years, the machine learning aspect will simplify itself a little bit and people will be able to do that themselves. So that's where I think it'll go.
Mm-hmm. And last question, how you see what is the role of new music in England or UK society?
What was the question? The role of it?
Yes, role in society, right? What it provides, right?
I think it provides generic aims like any other art form that you find. They all share the same aims and outcomes, right? To make people aware of things that you wouldn't really think about before, or to show technical ability is one aspect to it. I think the role of media new music today treads the exact of making people aware of things they wouldn't really think about. But I think the only difference is that the language that people are using in new media and new music nowadays, i.e., using game engines and interactive tools, is much more of the time. So, for example, people today love playing games and they understand how video games work. So if you can take that knowledge of how people know how video games work and translate it to the musical space, you're making it more accessible to people, and also you're creating new avenues for new expression. So I think, thinking out loud, I think it's that you've got this new creative space and opportunities for creative expression, and you're also tapping into what people are already familiar with and what's trending in terms of technology.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for this interview.
No problem.